Well, the Iowa caucuses are over, and as expected, Donald Trump won overwhelmingly. He is effectively the Republican presidential nominee at this point, and just like in 2016, Trump is leading in pretty much every poll in every state. In fact, he's doing better this time around than he was in 2016. So, from a historical perspective, this is a unique moment in American politics. It's rare for a former president to run for office again, and also have a serious chance of winning. It's only happened a handful of times in the history of this country, and that leads to some, shall we say, quirks in the process. And here's one of them. We're starting to see the same attacks against Donald Trump that we first saw all the way back in 2016. And even when these attacks make absolutely no sense 8 years later, after we saw him in office, they're still trotting them back out. Now, you might remember that in 2016, the big concern about Donald Trump, one of them anyway, was that aside from him, according to the left, being a racist and a transphobe and a sexist and all the phobes and ists and everything else, but one of the big ones that they brought up a lot was that Donald Trump would have control over the nuclear codes. And we had to worry about this because there's no telling what he would do with the nuclear codes, and he might just, launch a nuclear attack against a country because he's having a bad day. He might launch a nuclear attack against his own country. Who knows? Well, that's what they said. And needless to say, just to review recent history, he got into office and he didn't launch any nukes, actually. None at all. 0 nukes were launched. And now Donald Trump is back on the ballot, and because his political opponents aren't terribly creative, we're once again hearing a slightly warmed over version of the old hits. You're not hearing about the nuclear codes quite as often now, but we are hearing something similar to that. And this time around, instead of warning about nukes, they're going with something a little bit more generalized, a little more vague. And that's where the left loves to live. They love to live in an area that's vague and abstract and can be interpreted any number of ways. So now they're saying that if Donald Trump wins in November, then he's going to do some non-specific, but also very bad things with the military. Could that involve launching a nuclear attack? It could, but it could be anything, just something bad, a lot of bad things, actually. This headline comes to us from NBC News, which, as usual, is laundering the talking points of intel agencies and the Defense Department. Quote, "Fears grow that Trump will use the military in dictatorial ways if he returns to the White House." Well, what does that mean? Well, specifically, according to NBC News, quote, "Donald Trump is sparking fears among those who understand the inner workings of the Pentagon that he would convert the nonpartisan U.S. military into the muscular arm of his political agenda as he makes comments about dictatorship and devalues the checks and balances that underpin the nation's 2-century-old democracy." So, just to reiterate, people who understand the inner workings of the Pentagon are the brain trust behind this article. Who are those people? Well, it's not really clear who they are. It could mean Pentagon officials. Could be retired Pentagon officials. It could be current Pentagon officials. Maybe it's just people who think about the Pentagon a lot. We don't know. They're people who understand the inner workings. That's all you need to know. But that makes them experts. And NBC News says that we should trust these anonymous experts when they predict that Donald Trump will convert the nonpartisan U.S. military into the muscular arm of his political agenda. We should just trust them. There's a lot to think about here. And for one thing, really the first thing that comes to mind when you hear about this fear that Donald Trump will take the nonpartisan military and make it partisan, first thing that comes to mind is that, well, the nonpartisan military doesn't exist. So even if Trump wanted to do that, he couldn't, because there is no nonpartisan military to work with. The military is not nonpartisan anymore. And that's why they can't recruit anyone. That's one of the reasons anyway. They've spent so long demonizing the left's enemies, white males specifically, for political reasons, that they can't even meet their recruiting goals. And so it's not nonpartisan. But despite all that, NBC News and the Pentagon, well, no, not the Pentagon, but people who understand the inner workings of the Pentagon want you to believe that the military is functioning perfectly right now, and it's Donald Trump who's going to come along and make the military political and dysfunctional. And he's going to do that, we're told, by converting the military into an arm of his political agenda. And this is, of course, another attack that would have been fit right in to the 2016 narrative, might have been even effective in 2016. But anyone who's been alive for the past decade knows that it just doesn't make any sense now. And that's because almost every president in modern history has used the military to advance their political agenda. And in fact, Donald Trump's perhaps greatest achievement by far is that he didn't carry on with that tradition. He didn't turn Libya into an open-air slave market so that Hillary Clinton could feel like a strong and independent woman. He didn't invade Iraq on some phony intelligence about weapons of mass destruction. He didn't pull a Clinton and bomb Sudan to distract from a domestic scandal. So, I mean, really, you can make the case, really strong case, that Donald Trump was the single most restrained president in modern history when it comes to the use of the military. In all 4 years, the only time Democrats really became upset about Trump and his use of the military is when he visited the bombed-out church just outside the White House during the BLM riots. And that's the best hit they had. They said Mark Milley shouldn't have been in Trump's entourage or something like that. And for about 5 news cycles, they pretended to be really outraged by that. Of course, they didn't care about the BLM rioters torching the church or injuring dozens of police officers and Secret Service agents. They didn't care about that. They were laser focused on this one incident because it's the only example they could think of to make the case that Donald Trump had somehow co-opted the military to serve his own political ends. But again, there are many real cases of recent presidents in this country, in fact, every single recent president, doing exactly that. And Donald Trump was the one guy who didn't. But they have to lie about this, just like they lied about the nuclear codes in 2016. And the reason for the lie is the same. Just like in 2016, the point of the slander is to delegitimize the Trump administration and lay the groundwork for undermining it from within. 8 years ago, all the warnings about Trump's instability and nuclear codes and so on gave the FBI an important pretext to launch an indefinite investigation into his campaign. And we know how that turned out. If you convince millions of Americans that Donald Trump wants to be a dictator, a willing servant of Putin, then it's a lot easier to justify the illegal wiretaps of his campaign and everything else they did. The only difference is that back in 2016, nobody admitted any of this out loud. Like, nobody came out and said that they were actively working to undermine his authority. And now they're just coming out and saying it. Quoting from the NBC News article, now bracing for Trump's potential return, a loose-knit network of public interest groups and lawmakers is quietly devising plans to try to foil any efforts to expand presidential power, which could include pressuring the military to cater to his political needs. Now, if you're wondering what an insurrection or a coup looks like, well, it looks exactly like that. I mean, and the media is openly bragging about it. They're openly bragging about a deep state plot to usurp the president's authority. The article goes on to explain that, quote, those taking part in the effort told NBC News that they are studying Trump's past actions and 2024 policy positions so that they will be ready if he wins in November. That involves preparing to take legal action and send letters to Trump appointees spelling out consequences they'd face if they undermine constitutional norms. Because, you know, there's nothing these people care more about than constitutional norms, of course. So a bunch of left-wing activist groups are going to threaten Trump and threaten Trump appointees if they undermine, quote-unquote, constitutional norms, which are, you know, what are the norms? Well, those are the norms as they are defined by these left-wing activist groups. The left-wing activist groups will tell us what is constitutionally normal, and if you venture outside of that, then you should be in prison. That's the general approach. What would be interesting to know is how many of these activist groups ever threatened the Biden administration. You know, when the White House nationalized the rental properties or tried to force millions of people to take the COVID shot or tried to implement a mask mandate on airplanes, even though all available science said it was ridiculous, did any of these defenders of constitutional norms have any issue with that? No, of course they didn't. Now, in this article, NBC News is careful not to admit too much. You know, they're saying that the deep state is just going to file lawsuits and send letters. But, I mean, everyone knows that's not all they're going to do. At multiple points during the Trump administration, career officials in the Defense Department and the intelligence agencies openly defied the president and subverted his authority. As Jonathan Swan and Zachary Basu reported for Axios, quote, once in office, Trump's ambitions to withdraw from Afghanistan and other countries were subdued, slow-rolled, and detoured by military leaders. Now, to give one example, in the case of Syria, officials routinely lied to Donald Trump about the number of troops in the country, which is something much more serious and direct than sending letters and filing lawsuits. Jim Jeffrey, the former U.S. envoy to Syria, stated in an interview that, quote, we were always playing shell games to not make clear to our leadership how many troops we had there. And he said that in reality, the U.S. had a lot more than the 200 troops in northern Syria, which Trump had agreed to. And they lied to him. And that's like a direct quote. It's a Trump administration official admitting that they all just lied to the commander-in-chief about troop levels in Syria because they wanted to undermine his actual constitutional authority. You know, when you're running a business, time is money. And that's why I'm so excited to have Ramp as a new sponsor for my show. If you're a finance professional looking for a better way to maximize productivity and cut wasteful spending, then Ramp could be for you. Ramp is the corporate card and spend management software designed to help you save time and put money back in your pocket. With Ramp, you can issue cards to every employee with limits and restrictions, automate expense reporting, and stop wasting time at the end of every month. Ramp's accounting software automatically collects receipts and categorizes your expenses in real time, so you don't have to. You'll never have to chase down a receipt again, and your employees will no longer spend hours submitting expense reports. The time you'll save each month on employee expenses will allow you to close your books 8 times faster. Ramp is easy to use. Get started in less than 15 minutes, whether you have 5 employees or 5,000. Get $250 when you join Ramp. Just go to ramp.com/Walsh, spelled ramp.com/Walsh. Again, that's ramp.com/Walsh. Cards issued by Sutton Bank and Celtic Bank. Members FDIC. Terms and conditions apply. Now keep in mind, Donald Trump publicly ordered a full pullout from northern Syria. And there were a bunch of articles documenting this, but Jeffrey and the Pentagon just ignored it. As Jeffrey put it, quote, what's Syria withdrawal? There was never a Syria withdrawal. Because they were just going to ignore him. Now, call it the deep state, call it whatever you want. These people conspired to prevent Donald Trump from governing. And then they gloated about it. And this happened again and again. At one point, the New York Times played up this, you may remember, this op-ed from an anonymous Trump official saying that there's a, quote, resistance movement against Trump that was operating within the federal government. That's where we started hearing all this cringy stuff about the resistance, and that's where it came from. Except it came from someone who was supposedly inside the White House. Quote, like-minded colleagues and I have vowed to thwart parts of his agenda and his worst inclinations, according to the official. And leftists absolutely loved that. They also loved it when Mark Milley pledged to warn the Chinese government if Donald Trump ever ordered an attack that would affect Chinese interests, which last I checked is treason. I mean, it's among the most obvious, it's not just treason, it's among the most obvious, cases of treason that you can imagine. The chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff tipping off an adversary about possible U.S. military action. I mean, that's, you literally don't get more treasonous than that. But again, the media and Democrats celebrated it. So what these career operatives did is far more akin to dictatorship, far more than anything Trump ever did. Because for one thing, Americans elected Trump. Nobody elected these people. No one gave them the authority to keep U.S. troops in countries when the president wanted them gone. Nobody gave them authority to thwart everything Donald Trump attempted to do. And when he was acting on the agenda that he ran on, so this is what the voters wanted, and you're supposed to care about that if you care about democracy, they just went ahead and sabotaged him again and again. They kept subverting the will of the democratically elected president. It's what happened when Trump cut off weapons shipments to Ukraine, which naturally angered the weapons manufacturers. There was testimony at Trump's first impeachment hearing that the defense industry began flooding the Pentagon with phone calls shortly after the Trump administration suggested it would cut off these weapons shipments. And Well, what do you know? Within weeks, the CIA operative in the White House, whose name you were never allowed to know, leaked a classified call to Adam Schiff and kickstarted an impeachment. And that's the phone call where Trump made the mistake of mentioning the Biden family's corruption in Ukraine. And yet again, none of these defenders of democracy who are so upset about a second Trump term said a word about any of this. And that's because they're planning to do it again. And that's why the media will again paint Trump as a dictator so that they can prevent him from governing. Last night, as the Iowa caucus results came in, there were many media members that were on TV pushing this narrative against. Rachel Maddow was one of them. Watch.
The big picture takeaway from that, and I don't mean to be, again, too dark, as you said, on this, but it is not, if we are worried about the rise of authoritarianism in this country, we are worried about potential rise of fascism in this country, if we're worried about our democracy falling to an authoritarian and potentially fascist form of government, the leader who is trying to do that is part of that equation. Mm-hmm. But people wanting that is a much bigger part of that equation. Right. And the American electorate is made up of two major parties. One of those parties has been flirting with extremism on the ultra-right for a very long time. They've brought them in a way that they haven't been central to Republican electoral politics ever before, and I know because I've been studying this. But once you have radicalized one major party so that those are the preferences of the people who adhere to your party, the leader is interchangeable.
As a side note, that clip is interesting. It's one of the rare instances of Rachel Maddow and Chris Hayes being spotted in the same room at the same time. And sometimes it's not clear if Chris Hayes is just Rachel Maddow in drag or vice versa. We really don't know. But anyway, they're there together. And as for what Rachel Maddow said, of course, she's just further advancing the corporate messaging of NBC News. She wants NBC viewers to think that authoritarianism is coming. And so to prevent it, we need to imprison Donald Trump and kick him off the ballot. Because if you're worried about authoritarianism, the best way to prevent that is to imprison the top political rival of your favorite politician, of your guy. Like that's how you prevent authoritarianism. And of course, this was never a compelling argument, but it's especially unconvincing after Trump has already served as president for a whole term. And during that term, as Ron DeSantis has correctly noted, as I've said many times, far from being a dictator, Trump's problem when he was in office was exactly the opposite of that. It was exactly the opposite of being authoritarian. Trump, in fact, was as far on the other end of that scale as you can be. He was way too far on that end of it. Because if anything, Donald Trump was reluctant to use his power. He didn't wield his authority in situations where it was necessary and would have been perfectly legal to do so. He didn't even fire Tony Fauci for completely botching the COVID response. If you ask him why he didn't fire him, he'll tell you that it's because he didn't want the media to be mad at him. So that's not what a dictator says. That's not how a dictator behaves. And that's how non-dictatorial he was to his detriment. Now, at some level, it's clear that these propagandists are aware of how flimsy their case is. That's why last night, for the most part, they didn't allow their viewers to see or hear Donald Trump's victory speech. I mean, this is the presidential frontrunner who just won the Iowa caucuses. You're a news channel. No matter how you feel about it, this is news. It's the biggest thing happening in politics right now. But CNN cut away from Trump's speech the moment he began talking about the southern border. MSNBC made a big show of hiding the footage from their viewers. Watch.
At this point in the evening, the projected winner of the Iowa caucuses has just started giving his victory speech. We will keep an eye on that as it happens. We will let you know if there's any news made in that speech, if there's anything noteworthy, something substantive and important. The reason I'm saying this is, of course, there is a reason that we and other news organizations have generally stopped giving an unfiltered live platform to remarks by former President Trump. It is not out of spite. It is not a decision that we relish. It is a decision that we regularly revisit. And honestly, earnestly, it is not an easy decision, but there is a cost to us as a news organization of knowingly broadcasting untrue things. That is a fundamental truth of our business and who we are. And so his remarks tonight will not air here live. We will monitor them and let you know about any news that he makes.
Now, you notice that she can't even mention Donald Trump's name at first, right? It's the whole Voldemort thing. She refers to him as the winner of the Iowa caucuses. And then she lectures her viewers about how important it is to muzzle him. She appears to claim with a straight face that MSNBC might be sued if they air the victory speech of the presidential frontrunner. And by the way, if that's true, which it's not, any real journalist would welcome that lawsuit. I mean, that's you'll win that lawsuit in 45 seconds. But nobody at NBC is pretending that they're real journalists anymore. And again, this is all right out in the open now. So it's pretty clear after last night that the corporate press and their allies and the intelligence agencies aren't going to change their strategy. But it's also clear by extension that if Donald Trump wants any chance of actually governing this country, he's going to have to change his strategy and his approach. He's going to have to command the military instead of allowing the military to command him. He's going to have to get rid of the prosecutors and the bureaucrats who spent the last 4 years trying to imprison his supporters and do things even worse than that. He's going to have to stop making any effort to try to get these people to like him, whether these are the people at the New York Times or NBC or anywhere else. He's going to have to embrace being hated by them. It shouldn't be hard to do because you have no choice anyway. If Donald Trump becomes president after last night's results in Iowa, it's looking more and more likely, then he only has one option. Not that he should become a dictator, but that he should actually wield his lawful power and do it effectively and ruthlessly to advance the agenda that he's running on. And that if he's elected, he will be elected to advance. Which means that in that way, this time around, he's going to have to give these fearmongers precisely what they fear. If you'd like to see what else I have to say, you can access my full show by going to dailywire.com or by going to the Matt Walsh Show Twitter page. Hope to see you there. Godspeed.